Hello and welcome to another episode of Essential Implementation. If you look back across our history, we've got very good at problem analysis. We understand things like climate change and obesity very well, but our knowledge around implementing solutions to these problems seems to be a lot lower in comparison. My interviewee today, Professor Ioan Fazey, is Professor of Social Dimensions of Environmental Change based at the University of York. Ioan's been looking at how the research community might need to generate a different type of knowledge if we're going to implement solutions to these problems well. Hello, welcome to another episode of Essential Implementation. I'm very pleased to be here with Ioan Fazey. Would you like to introduce yourself, Ioan, to the podcast?
Yeah, so I'm professor in social dimensions of environmental change at the University of York, and I run some of the strategy work in the university around environment sustainability. Much of my work and research work is around the question of how we get big, deep change fast, although not many of us have the answers. I certainly don't have the full answers to that, but it's something that is really particularly important in the world of things like climate change and the massive shifts that are happening in the world and the things we have to deal with.
Yes. So in terms of climate change, I mean, what's your take on that? Are we, not really making as much progress as one would hope, or are things going well? How would you see that?
I think we're a very long way off from really tackling the challenge. And one of the really big issues around climate change is that essentially it's a 21st century challenge in the way that it is effectively a symptom of the way societies are organized and operate. And so it's not something that can be addressed by tweaking things around the edges. You have to get in there and shake up the systems and the underlying assumptions that underpin that. And so that requires a very different kind of change. The analogy to that sort of thing is things like the mental health issues that we're dealing with, or obesity, where really, yes, we can throw lots of interventions at them, but unless we start tackling, in case of obesity, things like mobility patterns or food system patterns or whatever they might be as well, then it's very, very unlikely that we're going to really make major moves in relation to that and its consequences around things like diabetes and so on.
Somebody sent me your paper, 10 Essentials for Action-Orientated and Second-Order Energy Transitions, Transformations and Climate Change Research. What really struck me was the way it was kind of saying, as an implementation scientist, I might need to actually do implementation to know how to do it and not just come up with a lot of academic knowledge. So be an intervener and actually try to change the outcome, not just watch it happen. And so I've been trying to apply that to what we're doing in the NHS. Would you like to kind of talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that paper was stimulated by this recognition that we need deep systemic changes if we're going to address things like climate change or 21st century challenges, however you want to define them. But so that was the beginning point of it. But if we're going to address that, we've got to start addressing the how questions. How are we going to create solutions, implement solutions, or work effectively in it? What we're very good in academia, and effectively academia has been built upon, and our research institutes and our higher education institutes, is that we are very, very good at problem analysis. We've kind of got that down to a T now. We're very good at doing that in different guises. But most of the big questions we're facing now is not about what the problem is, it's about the how. And of course, we need more information about the problem, and you always need to look at that, and you need to reconsider how you're thinking about that. But ultimately, we really, really have to get to that how, and that how-to knowledge will not necessarily be driven by the same methods that we've got that have been created the last 300 years in scientific and technological advance that give us that strength in the problem analysis. So, and the analogy there is, if you want to get to the how, you have to get on your bicycle and fall off, and you can't do it by just watching a PowerPoint presentation. You have to get your sort of hands dirty, learn by doing, and so on. And that's a real fundamental challenge to much of the assumptions underpinning our mode of science and research that we have at the moment, which is, no, you should not get involved in the intervention. You cannot get your hands dirty because that violates this assumption of the researcher being independent from what they're observing. So that's where it becomes a bit of a fundamental challenge, because our whole scientific basis and our institutions are set up and predicated on that underlying assumption of observer independence. And if you look at most institutions, in the US in the 60s and 70s, research institutes were developed specifically to be separate from practice. But if your goal is to improve your practice and get involved in the how, then you can't be separate from that practice too. So it raises these interesting challenges. I guess one of the ways that I think about it is the difference between, say, research. You can research on practice, so you can stand from the outside looking at the practice and learn from it, and that has validity on one level. Or you can do your sort of research for practice, where you might be engaged a little bit in it, stepping in and step out. Or you can see research as practice. So if you imagine an artist doesn't create a piece of artwork by sort of watching somebody else do it. They do it. They are the creation, and the product and the artifact that they create at the end of it is the research. So it's not some written piece of form that comes out. You see the creativity and the aspect that's been created from it. So it's a very different notion of what research is, and therefore where you fit within it. And you could imagine that around a transformative policy for supporting a dietary shift, for example, in society. Why could that not be the research processes in its own right, just in the way that an art form is created? Now, the artist might say something that's not right either, but at the same time, it's this notion of, what is the knowledge creation process, and what kind of knowledge are we producing? And that's the other thing that stems into this, is the, what is knowledge? It becomes a really challenging question. And what is knowledge creation, and how do we come to know something? And again, there are a lot of very, very hard assumptions about what that means. And until we start, asking ourselves the questions of what do we mean by that, then that really matters. So what is knowledge, and what are we trying to create in that process? And is knowledge the only thing we're trying to create? So there's very, very different kinds of knowledge. There's what we might call embodied knowledge. And there's the abstract knowledge. So what we're very good in academia at doing is creating lots of written pieces, but that's in an abstracted form of something we've produced. Now, Aristotle talks about three kinds of knowledges in its broad sense. So he talks about the epistemic knowledge. That's the abstracted stuff that we are very good at producing in academia. He also talks about the techne and the phronesis. So the techne is the sort of know-how. So how do you drive a car? How does a surgeon work to work on a patient? Those sorts of things. It's sort of very difficult to explain. Your teacher can't explain what they're doing in the classroom very easily. It's very much tacit and held within there. And then you've got the phronesis, which is a sort of wisdom-based knowledge, the ethical knowledge about whether you're achieving something for a good end. A surgeon who is cutting somebody up with a knife, yes, has a very strong ethical notion of what they're doing and why they're doing it. That's very different from somebody coming to stab somebody with a knife, for example. So what makes a good end is part of the knowledge package, if you like, to get to that know-how. Now, if you want to learn to ride a bicycle, you need all three of those knowledges. You need to understand a little bit about how a bike works. You need the embodied knowledge of how you use the gears and pedal at the same time, which you might not be able to explain very well to somebody, but you also need to know why you're doing it and why you're trying to get there. So if we want to get into that how-to space, we have to have this much greater diversity of knowledge. It comes back to then the question, well, what do we do about that? And if all our systems and structures are set up to operate in a particular way, then we've got a problem. And so, for example, in relation to most of the work that I do around climate change, then for me, a big question is, well, what would it look like for a university to be able to contribute much more directly in the space of getting to the how-to questions around how do we transform societies in order to be able to address the climate challenge? And the only conclusion you come to there is that universities then also need to transform in order to be able to get there. We are probably mostly focused on the problem analysis still, even though the biggest question is not that anymore. It's like, how do we deal with it and how do we make change happen? And actually, academic institutions are not really that well known for their ability to shift and change. They are some of the longest standing institutions in the world, right? So some of them are centuries old. Large corporations might last at best a century or so, but maybe mostly in decades. And so that the whole issue for universities is that they have longevity, but does that necessarily mean that they can shift and change in the ways that we probably need them to now? I did a quick on the back of the envelope calculation a couple of years ago, probably about three years ago now, of about 5,000 papers on climate change. I skimmed through them. This is definitely back of the envelope calculation. But I figured that from what I could see in the papers that were produced, roughly about 5,000 in 1 year around climate change, roughly 90% were problem analysis, roughly 8% might be about solutions sort of creation, only about 2% was implementation. Right. So I think whatever the figure is, it really says that we're probably not doing anywhere near as much as we should be. And I think one of the things in there is also what's your goal? Is your goal just to improve something, or is it actually to change something significantly? Even if you think about much of the public sectors, for example, so education, NHS, healthcare systems, many other systems, the whole remit and mantra is not to change the system. You don't want to mess with it too much, because if we lose it and it collapses, then we don't want it. So what tends to happen there is where you get something that is particularly innovative, then what tends to happen is that will essentially get captured and brought back in to support the existing system. So it takes a long time before any major change comes about. So the trick and the challenge then is if you want to get the major systemic forms of change, then it's about how do you sort of juggle this and co-manage the need for keeping the system going whilst also bringing about something very, very different. And you need different styles of management, leadership, governance in that in combination to bring about those sorts of things. And again, that comes back to the question. It's not a question about the problem anymore. It's a question about the how. So how could science and our research really effectively help us learn how to do those big shifts? We don't know the answers, but the only way we're going to learn is by trying. A really great example that I came across a few years ago, it was through the projects from the Soil Association, which they certify organic farming. And they had a program where they were providing funding for research projects where you had to have a farmer and an academic in the application. And what they'd noticed was that farmers doing lots and lots of experimentation on their fields. How do we produce better? How do we create greater yields, but following the organic principles and so on? But in this notion of the funding, the role of the researcher was not to be the researcher or the experimenter. That was the role of the farmer. The farmer was doing the experiments. The role of the researcher was to help them learn how to do the experiments better, right? And how they can learn more effectively from. That's just a good example of a shift away from thinking about research for research and just knowledge creation to research as learning. And I think we've lost sight of that in universities a lot of the time. We churn the wheel. Let's produce more and more knowledge. We've got plenty of knowledge. We don't need any more knowledge. There's tons of it out there. We've pretty much solved that problem, really.
And it's very exciting. I think in the implementation science, it's slowly is going that way. When I spoke to Laura Damschroeder in a previous interview, she talks about being an embedded researcher. She'd be embedded within a context with practitioners, but it would be the practitioners that were really coming up with some of that knowledge about what maybe needed to change and how to do it, and then go about doing it with her help. There's someone else, Abe Wondersman, who's created this thing called the Readiness Thinking Tool. He talks about technical assistance. So that would be how he sees kind of helping the people in these contexts to actually generate that action knowledge that you were talking about. And I think COVID's also been quite a good example of how when you leave clinicians to just do things, they actually do them pretty well. And so seems pretty positive.
We've got a long way to go. I mean, I think I think that I'm quite well. In some ways, the deep change is inevitable, and so at one level, there's a positivity out of that. It's going to have to just emerge and come.
Yeah.
But the negative side of that, can we do it quick enough? And are we going to be able to respond quick enough? And that's where it's a bit more problematic. So I do feel that there's a real responsibility that's needed for us in higher education institutes and the privileges that provides for us to really seriously look at what we're doing and what we're producing and what our focus is.
Ioan Fazey, thank you for your time, and hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you very much.